The dust hadn't even settled on the dirt road when she came storming in. Sunglasses, clipboard, and the kind of confidence only the truly entitled carry. "This ranch is mine," she snapped, pointing at my grandpa's land like it was some HOA playground. Little did she know, I'm the mayor. The late afternoon sun bled gold across the wide Montana sky as my truck rolled up the winding gravel road to Grandpa's ranch, the old cedar posts and split rail fences glowing like fire. In the distance, each mile carrying the familiar scent of dust, pine, and hay that had lingered in my childhood memories for decades. I hadn't been here in months, too busy with city meetings, ribbon cuttings, and the endless politics of being the youngest mayor this county had ever elected. But Grandpa's call that morning had held a note of worry I couldn't ignore. "Something ain't right here," he'd said in his gravelly voice, the one that had commanded cattle drives and family reunions alike, a man carved out of hard work and the kind of integrity people wrote country songs about. He didn't explain further, just told me to come. And so I did. But I wasn't prepared, not for the sight that greeted me the second I stepped out of my truck. There she was, mid-50s, hair sprayed stiff enough to withstand a tornado, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon forged in the fires of self-righteousness. The kind of woman who looked like she'd memorized every HOA bylaw in existence and tattooed the important ones on her soul. She wore a bright pink blazer despite the heat, oversized sunglasses reflecting the ranch house behind me, and an expression that said she owned the sun, the sky, and everything they touched. "This property," she declared the moment my boots hit the dirt, "is under the jurisdiction of the Hidden Springs Homeowners Association. Effective immediately, it falls under my authority as HOA president." Her voice had that sharp, nasal pitch, the kind that made you want to reach for aspirin. I blinked, glanced back at the ranch house where Grandpa stood on the porch, arms crossed, jaw set like granite. He didn't look surprised, didn't even look angry, just tired. Like he'd been dealing with this woman for longer than I realized. "Ma'am," I began carefully, dusting off my jeans, "I think there's been some mistake. This ranch has been in my family since before Hidden Springs was even a thing." She stepped closer, heels stabbing the dirt like she was claiming territory with every click. "Not a mistake," she snapped, thrusting a folder of papers toward me. "Hidden Springs Covenant, Section 12. All properties within the expanded residential boundary fall under HOA management. Your so-called ranch is included as of last month's vote." I stared at her like she'd just told me the sky was turning plaid, my hand hovering over the stack of papers she shoved at me, because in all my years growing up here, in all Grandpa's stories about tough winters, cattle rustlers, and the occasional land dispute, never, not once, had anyone marched up this drive claiming our ranch fell under some suburban committee's thumb. "Expanded residential boundary?" I repeated slowly, as though saying it aloud might make it make sense. "Lady, this is a cattle ranch, not a cul-de-sac." But she was already scanning the yard like she was preparing citations. Paint peeling. On the barn door, fence post leaning at an angle, grass a little high near the ditch. The nerve of it hit me like a slap. Grandpa cleared his throat on the porch, that deep rumble that used to silence us kids instantly. "She came by last week," he said, voice low but carrying like distant thunder. "Told me same thing. I sent her packing." The woman, Karen, because of course that was her name, had to be, turned sharply toward him, lips pursed like she'd bitten into a lemon. "And I informed you," she said, each word clipped, "that ignoring official HOA notices does not exempt you from compliance. The bylaws are clear. All properties within the new boundary." "New boundary my foot," Grandpa snapped. And there it was. The flash of the man who once stared down bank lenders and county commissioners alike when they tried to seize grazing land back in the 80s. "This land's been in my family since before your HOA was a twinkle in some developer's greedy eye. Nobody voted on nothing that concerns me." I watched them square off, the wind kicking dust between us, a hawk circling lazy in the distance, like even it sensed a storm brewing. Karen didn't back down. The board voted unanimously. Annexation into Hidden Springs jurisdiction passed last month. "This property," she jabbed a manicured finger at the ground, "is now subject to all HOA regulations, Exterior maintenance, noise ordinances, approved color palettes. Color palettes? I barked a laugh before I could stop myself. You want us to paint the barn taupe so it matches the neighbors' garages? Her eyes slid to me for the first time with real irritation, like she'd just noticed I wasn't some hired ranch hand, but someone with enough backbone to talk. Back. And you are? She asked sharply. I almost grinned. Oh, she was going to love this. Name's Luke Carter, I said easily, tucking my thumbs in my belt like Grandpa used to. Owner's grandson and mayor of Hidden Springs. That landed like a stone in a still pond. For the first time since she'd strutted up here, Karen faltered, her mouth opening just slightly before snapping shut again like a trap. She hadn't expected that, not here among the hay bales and weathered siding, not from the man standing between her clipboard and conquest. Mayor, she repeated carefully, like maybe she thought she'd misheard. That's right, I said, taking a step closer so she had to tilt her head back just a little. Elected last spring, sworn in, ribbon cut, handshakes all around. Which means if there's been some boundary change, some annexation vote dragging private ranch land into HOA territory without so much as a conversation, well, that falls under my office's jurisdiction, not yours. Grandpa chuckled low on the porch, the sound like gravel rolling downhill. Karen's spine stiffened. The board followed procedure, she said tightly, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, the faintest crack in that lacquered armor. She hadn't expected pushback from anyone who could actually challenge her. Karen recovered fast, I'll give her that. One blink, one shallow breath, and her face was back to its usual porcelain mask of determination, the kind of look people wear when they've spent their lives winning arguments by sheer stubbornness rather than facts. She hugged the clipboard to her chest like a shield. Regardless of your position, she said, her voice rising again, the HOA has the authority to enforce its bylaws. These votes were public record. Notices were posted. Posted where? I shot back, heat creeping into my tone. On the HOA clubhouse bulletin board next to bingo night announcements, because nobody who actually lives outside your subdivision saw them. I could feel Grandpa's eyes on me, could almost hear him thinking, don't lose your temper, boy, the same way he used to when I was 12 and ready to fistfight anyone who insulted our family dog. Karen flipped through her paperwork with unnecessary drama, each page snapping like she was cracking a whip. Notices, she repeated triumphantly, pulling one free and waving it like the 10 Commandments, were mailed to all affected property owners. If you failed to check your mail, that is not the HOA's problem. Grandpa barked a laugh then, sharp and humorless. Lady, the only mail I got was a flyer for discounted septic tank cleaning. If you think that counts as legal notice... Enough, I cut in, my voice carrying like it did at council meetings when people wouldn't stop bickering about pothole budgets. Here's what's going to happen. I'm taking this paperwork. I plucked it neatly from her hand before she could react. And I'm going to review every line, every vote, every so-called annexation map you people cooked up. If there's even a hint this was done without proper procedure, without county oversight or landowner consent, then congratulations, you've just marched onto the wrong ranch barking up the wrong tree. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out this time. I could see the flicker of doubt growing behind those sunglasses, the realization that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't steamrolled some retired farmer but had walked straight, into the mayor's backyard like a wolf in pearls. The wind picked up, snapping the screen door on the porch, sending a swirl of dust around our boots. Somewhere behind the barn, a cow lowed like it too had an opinion on HOA annexations. This isn't over, Karen said finally, her voice tight but thinner now, less certain. Oh, I'm counting on it, I replied, tucking the folder under my arm. Because here's the thing about people like her. They thrived on folks rolling over, on neighbors too busy or too polite to fight back. But I'd spent my whole life watching Grandpa stand his ground through droughts, debts, and developers with fancier lawyers than any HOA could dream of. And I hadn't run for mayor just to cut ribbons at grocery store openings. If Karen thought this ranch would go quietly under her thumb, she was in for one hell of a surprise. Karen turned on her heel like she owned the dirt under her shoes, marching back toward her shiny white SUV parked crookedly at the end of the Drive, but not before delivering one last promise over her shoulder. Expect fines. Lots of them. The board doesn't tolerate non-compliance. Then she was gone in a cloud of dust and self-importance, leaving the air around us vibrating with the kind of tension that always follows a storm, even a small one. I stood there a long moment, watching the SUV disappear down the road, the sun dipping lower behind the hills, painting the sky bruised purple and gold. Grandpa stepped down off the porch, his boots creaking against the wood, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw the weariness in his shoulders. "She's been here twice already," he said quietly, like admitting it tasted bad in his mouth. "Came first time with that same folder, talking about bylaws and paint colors. Second time she brought some fella from the board. Looked like he ain't ever done a day's work in his life. Said if we didn't start bringing the property up to code, they'd start issuing penalties." He spat in the dust, a sharp gesture of disgust, like the words themselves were poison. "Told 'em both to get off my land. Guess that didn't stick." I tightened my grip on the folder under my arm. The wind flipped one corner open, revealing maps, typed minutes from some HOA meeting, and what looked like a boundary line drawn in red ink that cut straight through the Carter Ranch like it was nothing more than a Monopoly board. Something, in my chest, burned hot. This wasn't just about Karen and her clipboard crusade. This smelled like money, like someone somewhere wanted this land boxed in, controlled, maybe even sold off once the ranching stopped being worth the hassle. Grandpa watched me, his face half-shadowed by the fading light. "What you thinkin', Luke?" I looked at him, at the man who raised my father, who taught me to ride before I could tie my own boots, who'd kept this land running through floods, fires, and one spectacular grasshopper plague when I was 9. "I'm thinking," I said slowly, "that this board doesn't know who they're messing with. And if they want to fight over this ranch, they just picked the wrong family." Grandpa's mouth twitched, the ghost of a grin breaking through the worry. "You sound like your old man," he said. I smiled faintly, but my mind was already racing. Next council meeting, county zoning laws, the fact that as mayor I had the power to call for a review of any annexation attempt within city limits. Karen thought she could waltz in here with her bylaws and boundaries, but she'd walk straight into a legal buzzsaw wearing heels. And if she thought fines and citations would scare Grandpa into submission, she clearly didn't know the man who once chained himself to a fence post to stop a highway expansion from eating up his pasture land. The sky darkened above us, stars, beginning to poke through like silver nails in a velvet sheet. Out here, away from city lights, the night came fast and thick. Grandpa slapped my shoulder as he passed me on his way back inside. "Come on in, Luke," he said. "Supper's getting cold. Tomorrow we'll see what those papers really say." I followed him, the folder tucked tight under my arm, my jaw set. Because tomorrow wasn't just about papers. Tomorrow was the start of something bigger, and Karen had no idea what kind of war she'd just declared. The next morning dawned sharp and clear, the kind of blue sky day that made the mountains look close enough to touch, the air cool with dew and the smell of wood smoke drifting from Grandpa's kitchen chimney. I sat at his old oak table, coffee steaming in front of me. The folder Karen had left spread open like a crime scene between us. Grandpa shuffled in with a plate of eggs and bacon, setting it down beside me before lowering himself into the opposite chair with a grunt that spoke of 70 years of ranch work. "So," he asked, nodding toward the papers. I rubbed a hand. Over my jaw, eyes scanning line after line of HOA meeting minutes, annexation votes, and maps labeled with parcel numbers in neat black print. The whole thing stank. According to the so-called records, the HOA board had voted 6 weeks ago to expand its jurisdictional boundaries to streamline community management and increase property value consistency across the Hidden Springs district. But tucked deep in the legal jargon was the kicker. Any property within the new boundary was automatically subject to HOA bylaws unless the owner filed a formal exemption request within 30 days of the vote, which of course nobody had told Grandpa about. "They posted the notice on a bulletin board inside their clubhouse," I muttered, jabbing a finger at the tiny print, "and stuck one ad in the back of the local paper nobody reads. Then they Counted down 30 days in silence and now claim everyone agreed by default. Grandpa's eyes narrowed, the way they used to when he spotted a coyote too close to the chicken coop. Sounds like a scam to me. That's because it is, I said flatly. They're trying to rope this ranch in on a technicality. Once it's under HOA control, they can start enforcing code violations, run you ragged with fines until you're ready to sell. And I'd bet my truck there's a developer waiting in the wings to snatch it up cheap. Grandpa's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Over my dead body, he said finally. I nodded slowly, a cold resolve settling in my chest. Then we fight this. Legally, politically, however we have to. First step, I'm calling an emergency council session. As mayor, I can challenge the annexation's validity on procedural grounds. If this expansion was passed without proper notice to landowners, the whole thing can be thrown out. Grandpa chewed thoughtfully, eyes on the window where sunlight spilled across the pasture, the cattle grazing like they didn't know their land was under siege. She'll come back, you know, he said after a moment. That woman, Karen, she ain't the quitting kind. Good, I said, stacking the papers back into the folder. Let her. Next time she shows up, I'll be ready. And she won't just be facing you on this porch, Grandpa. She'll be facing the mayor, the council, and every law she tried to twist in her favor. He grunted approvingly, reaching for his coffee. Outside, a truck rattled past on the distant road, carrying someone into town where word of yesterday's confrontation would be spreading like wildfire. Small towns were like that. News traveled faster than wind through wheat, and by noon everyone from the diner waitress to the postmaster would know Karen had marched onto Carter land demanding compliance and left empty-handed. I stood, tucking the folder under my arm again. I'll head into City Hall, I said. Start lining up the paperwork. We'll hit 'em where it hurts, right in the bylaws. Grandpa's grin was slow but fierce, the kind of smile I hadn't seen on him since the day I won the mayoral race. That's my boy, he said. And as I walked out into the bright morning, the grass wet under my boots, the mountains watching, like silent witnesses, I knew this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about pride, family, and drawing a line so deep in the dirt not even Karen and her HOA army could cross it. The next few days passed like a fuse burning toward dynamite, the kind of slow-building tension you felt in your chest before a cow. Summer storm blew the roof off because Karen didn't waste any time after our first confrontation. By Monday morning, bright and early, she was back, this time with two men in suits who looked like they'd been ordered from a discount lawyer catalog, one carrying a leather briefcase like it held the secrets of the universe, the other clutching a camera he kept pointing at the barn, the fences, even Grandpa's tractor like he was gathering evidence for some high-stakes trial instead of prowling around a cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere. I was already outside waiting because Grandpa had called me at dawn, his voice a low growl over the phone. She's here again, Luke. Brought reinforcements this time. So I'd driven out from town, still half-fueled by coffee and annoyance, stepping out of my truck just as Karen launched into a speech about code violations and non-compliance fees stacking up by the day. She wore the same pink blazer like it was battle armor, her hair sprayed to perfection, sunglasses hiding whatever soul lived behind them, and she waved a stack of papers thicker than last time, citing sections and clauses from her beloved HOA covenant while the man with the camera snapped photos of peeling paint and a broken gate hinge like we were harboring state secrets instead of a few loose boards. Grandpa stood on the porch again, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching her like he might watch a coyote nosing too close to the chicken coop, and I walked right up between them, palms out like a referee stepping into the ring. "Morning, folks," I said lightly, though my voice carried steel underneath. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Karen turned, lips already curling like she'd been rehearsing this moment in the mirror all night. "The board," she began with that nasal authority that made every word sound like it came stamped with approval from Mount Olympus, "has voted to begin formal enforcement action against this property for failure to comply with HOA regulations. Fines will accrue daily until the property is brought to code, and if unpaid, a lien may be placed to recover costs." She said it like she was announcing a royal decree, chin high, clipboard clutched like a scepter, the men beside her nodding, like background actors in a low-budget drama. I let her finish. Let the silence hang just long enough before I smiled slow and easy, the kind of smile that made people shift on their feet because they couldn't tell if it meant trouble was coming, then said, "Well, that's interesting. Karen, because as of last night, the city council voted to freeze any enforcement tied to the annexation until a full procedural review is complete." That landed like a hammer on glass. She blinked once, twice, lips parting just slightly before snapping shut, a faint flush creeping up her neck, because clearly she hadn't heard that little bit of news yet, and behind her the man with the camera lowered it uncertainly while the briefcase guy cleared his throat like maybe he wanted to be anywhere else. You can't do that," Karen sputtered finally. But I was already holding up a copy of the council's resolution, the ink barely dry, the official seal catching the morning light like a badge. "See, that's the thing," I said pleasantly. "We can, and we did. Turns out annexation votes have to follow state notification laws, not just HOA bylaws, and when they don't, well, enforcement gets paused until the courts sort it out." Karen's face froze in that way people's faces do when the world doesn't play along with their script. Her mouth set in a thin line like she'd swallowed a lemon whole, and for the first time since she marched onto Grandpa's land with all her big talk and bigger attitude, I saw something new flicker in her eyes. Not rage, not arrogance, but hesitation, the kind of crack in the armor that shows when someone realizes they might be out of their depth. She covered it quick, though, clearing her throat, planting one manicured hand on her hip like she owned the whole county, then snapping her fingers at the briefcase man who shuffled forward with all the enthusiasm of a man headed for the gallows, handing her some paperwork that she immediately thrust at me like it was supposed to end the entire debate right there on the front lawn. "Temporary council freezes," she said sharply, voice climbing back toward its usual pitch. "Don't negate property owners' obligations under the covenant. This ranch is still within HOA jurisdiction, and you are still in violation of multiple ordinances, including but not limited to exterior maintenance, structural safety, and aesthetic conformity. Failure to comply will result in..." "In what?" I cut in smoothly, stepping closer so she had to tilt her head back a little, my shadow falling across the neat heels she'd planted in the dust. "A fine you can't enforce? A lien? The county clerk won't even file because the annexation's legality is under review? Or maybe a lawsuit that'll get laughed out of court once the judge sees how you folks redefined public notice as a scrap of paper thumbtacked to a bulletin board behind a locked door." The briefcase man winced like someone had smacked him. The camera guy pretended to check his lens, but really, he just didn't want to make eye contact. And Grandpa chuckled low on the porch, the sound like dry thunder rolling across the prairie before a storm. Karen's jaw worked, but no words came out for a long moment, and in that silence the wind picked up, carrying the smell of hay and cattle and wood smoke, the kind of smell that said this land had been here long before HOAs and their bylaws and would be here long after. Finally, she found her voice, tight and clipped now, all the polish stripped off. "This isn't over, Mr. Mayor. The board will pursue every legal avenue available." I smiled because I'd been waiting for that line, waiting for her to throw down the gauntlet so I could throw it right back twice as hard. "Good," I said evenly, tucking the papers under my arm, "because while you've been busy filing threats, I've been busy filing for an injunction of my own, one that freezes not just enforcement, but the entire annexation until the courts decide whether your board violated state law in the first place." That got her attention. Even the briefcase guy straightened at that, frowning like maybe he was picturing the legal fees piling up already. And for the first time, I saw real uncertainty ripple across Karen's perfect posture because she might win battles with scare tactics and boilerplate bylaws, but she wasn't used to someone fighting back with actual law, the kind written in statutes and upheld by judges instead of self-important committees meeting over coffee cake in a clubhouse. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned on her heel so sharp a puff of dust rose around her shoes, marching back to her car with both lawyers scrambling after her like ducklings after a very angry mother goose, and as their SUV disappeared. Down the road, I felt the knot in my chest ease just a little, because the game had changed now. This wasn't just Karen versus the Carter Ranch anymore, it was Karen versus the mayor, the council, the county, and the entire legal weight of a state that didn't take kindly to private boards overstepping their bounds. The next week felt Like the whole county was holding its breath because Karen might have stormed off that morning with her little lawyer entourage. But she didn't vanish. Not her style. And sure enough, by Wednesday afternoon, she was back. This time not at the ranch, but at City Hall. Striding into the council chamber like she owned the place, a stack of papers in her arms, and half a dozen HOA board members trailing behind her like backup dancers at the world's worst performance. I was there waiting because I'd called the emergency session myself, the one to formally review the annexation vote, and the room was already packed wall to wall with townsfolk hungry for drama, farmers with sunburned faces, shop owners in dusty boots, even Mrs. Langley from the diner sitting in the front row clutching her purse like she was watching a soap opera live. Karen launched into her speech the moment the gavel dropped, rattling off bylaws and precedents, her voice rising higher with each sentence until it bounced off the old wood-paneled walls, demanding the council reject my injunction request and uphold the HOA's expansion so they could bring order and uniformity to properties like the Carter Ranch, which, she added with a pointed glare at me, had become a blight on the community with its unpainted structures and unregulated land use. That got a low murmur from the crowd because everyone in that room knew Grandpa's ranch had been here before most of them were born. That its weathered barn and sprawling pastures were as much a part of this land as the hills themselves. And when I finally stood to respond, the place went dead quiet. Even Karen falling silent, though her eyes stayed locked on me like twin daggers. I didn't give a speech full of legal jargon or political theater because folks in this town didn't care about that. They cared about fairness, about neighbors respecting neighbors, about land passed down through generations not being snatched, by technicalities buried in fine print, so I told them the truth. Plain and simple. How the HOA had posted its public notices in places nobody outside their subdivision would ever see. How state law required direct notification for annexations like this, and they'd skipped that step entirely. How their threat to fine Grandpa into submission while the vote's legality was under review wasn't just arrogant, it was illegal. I laid out the maps, the timelines, the statutes highlighted in yellow, and when I was done, I looked straight at Karen and said, calm but clear. This isn't about paint colors or fence heights. This is about power, about a board trying to grab land it has no right to because it thinks nobody will stand up and stop it. Well, I'm standing up. That broke the room open like a lightning strike, applause and shouts rising from the crowd, the kind of noise that carries years of frustration in it because Karen and her HOA had pushed too far for too long, and even some of her own board members shifted in their seats, eyes dropping to the floor like maybe they hadn't signed up for this much heat. By the time the council voted unanimously to uphold the injunction and send the annexation to district court for full review, Karen's face was pale under all that makeup, her mouth a tight line like she'd bitten through her own tongue, and she gathered her papers with stiff, jerky movements before marching out of the chamber without a word. The board members scrambling after her while the crowd spilled into the hallway, buzzing like a kicked beehive. Grandpa clapped me on the shoulder outside, his grin wide and fierce, and said, "Reckon she didn't see that coming." But I wasn't smiling yet because I knew Karen wasn't done, not by a long shot, and if she was smart, and she was just cunning enough to be dangerous, she'd come back swinging harder than ever, which meant the real fight, the one that would decide everything, was still ahead. The district court date came faster than anyone expected, and when that morning sun rose over the hills and painted the fields gold, the Carter Ranch felt like the eye of a storm because this wasn't just about fences or bylaws anymore. It was about a small-town family standing toe-to-toe with a machine that thought it could swallow everything in its path. Karen arrived early, of course, dressed in her usual power suit and sunglasses, a fresh squad of lawyers in tow this time, faces pale and tight like they hadn't slept in days. And when she spotted me standing with Grandpa and our attorney on the courthouse steps, she gave the kind of smile wolves give before they lunge, but there was a tremor in it now, a crack in the flawless mask she always wore, because this time the cameras weren't hers, the reporters weren't hers, and the law sure as hell wasn't hers. Inside, the courtroom filled with neighbors and townsfolk who had taken the day off work to see this through, because by now everyone knew this fight wasn't just for our land, but for theirs too. A stand against every time the HOA had bullied. Someone over a shed roof or a paint color or a pasture they claimed didn't meet aesthetic standards. The judge, a tall man with a voice like gravel, listened in silence as Karen's lawyers rattled off accusations about property neglect and community standards, about how annexation was for the greater good, about how progress required tough decisions and shared sacrifice. But when our turn came, our attorney rose slowly, laid out the timeline of secret meetings, the missing notices, the votes taken behind closed doors, and then, like a hammer blow, the state statute requiring direct landowner consent for annexations, the one Karen and her board had either ignored or never bothered to read, and you could feel the shift in the room then, the subtle weight tipping, as the judge leaned forward, brow furrowing deeper with each exhibit and affidavit. By the time Grandpa himself spoke, voice rough but steady as he told the court how this land had been in our family for 3 generations, how it fed cattle and crops and kids alike, how it wasn't just acres on a map, but a living thing cared. For with sweat and calloused hands, there wasn't a sound in that courtroom except the hum of the lights overhead. Even the reporters had stopped typing, pens frozen mid-scratch. Karen tried to interrupt once, something about property values and community vision, but the judge held up a single hand and she went quiet, because even she could tell the wind had shifted. The storm she brought was blowing straight back at her. Now, when the ruling finally came that afternoon, it landed like a thunderclap. The annexation was void. The HOA had violated multiple statutes. All fines and enforcement actions against the Carter Ranch were nullified, and any further attempts to claim the property without proper consent would result in sanctions against the board itself. The room erupted, neighbors cheering, Grandpa gripping my hand so hard I thought he might crack bones, reporters shouting questions Karen refused to answer as she stormed out red-faced and tight-lipped, her little army of lawyers scattering behind her like leaves in a gale. Outside, under that wide, endless sky, folks clapped me on the back, shook Grandpa's hand. Kids ran across the courthouse lawn waving homemade signs that said things like, "Ho can't eat our land" in crooked marker letters, and for the first time in months, maybe years, the air felt lighter, freer. Like the whole town had taken its first deep breath after holding it too long. We drove back to the ranch as the sun sank low, the pastures glowing orange, the barn casting long shadows, and Grandpa stood by the fence a long time, looking out over the fields before saying in that quiet way of his, "Your grandma would have liked this day," and I just nodded because words didn't feel big enough right then. Karen vanished after that, at least from our lives. Rumor was she resigned from the board a few weeks later, after the state attorney general opened an investigation into HOA annexation practices across the county. A probe that started with our case and was already uncovering all kinds of backroom deals she and her board had pulled for years. But by then I didn't care about her or her empire of bylaws and fines because the ranch was safe. The land was ours, and sometimes winning isn't loud or fast. It's steady, like fence posts sunk deep in the soil, like roots that hold through every storm, like a family that doesn't back down when the world comes knocking with papers and threats and the kind of arrogance that thinks it can buy history with signatures. That night, the neighbors came out for a bonfire in the south pasture, cars parked in rows along the fence line, kids chasing each other with sparklers while old men argued over who made the best chili, music drifting from somebody's pickup, radio, and as the flames roared higher and the stars came out one by one, I thought about Karen, about the courtroom, about the council chamber packed with people who had finally stood up together, and I realized this fight had never just been about a ranch or an HOA or even a mayor trying to protect his grandfather's land. It was about a town remembering that power only works when people let it, that the loudest bully in the room folds, fast when neighbors stop whispering and start shouting back. Grandpa clapped me on the shoulder as the fire cracked and the sky stretched dark and endless overhead, and he said, "Reckon this place will be here long after both of us are gone?" And I believed him because some roots go too deep for any storm or any Karen to rip out.